Welcome back to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. What do farmers worry about? My episode today hopes to address that question. Our food system is intimately connected to the health of individuals and society, and yet our food system is challenged in a variety of ways. Today's episode will address those challenges through numerous lenses. Through sources that I've read that were shared with me by people involved in the food and agriculture industries, and also through first-person interviews that I've done with farmers and those who work with farmers. This episode will discuss the Farm Bill, which is a huge piece of legislation that covers everything from farm subsidies to ways that we can improve land and develop it, to everything involving farmer finances. And the Farm Bill also pays for SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as food stamps. Today's episode will be quite different from previous episodes. I'm going to walk you through many of these resources, but also weave together the voices of three individuals who I spoke with for this episode. The first person that I spoke with is Heather Sanford. Heather is a former full-time farmer, and she now works as a consultant for many farmers and people in the agriculture and food industries. Heather lives in the Finger Lakes region of New York, and she's very passionate about the food industry and how health and agriculture and food are all connected. The second person that I spoke with is James Black. He works for GivLyfe, which is a company that produces soil microorganisms that actually improve the microbiome of the soil. This might sound like a totally crazy topic because we're used to talking about the microbiome when it comes to human health and the gut, but of course these two things are intimately connected, and James will walk us through that. I also spoke with Katherine Carestio. She's a farmer living in the Finger Lakes region of New York. She took a piece of totally uninhabitable, non-productive land, and she and her husband used ruminants to transform that land. And now she and her family live on that land, producing grass-fed beef and serving and feeding their community. These three incredible individuals sat down with me and answered the many questions that I had about why they continue to choose farming, food, and agriculture despite all of its setbacks, the role that the Farm Bill plays in their lives, all of the challenges facing our food system and the future of health, food, and agriculture in America, and what they believe the average citizen can do to improve the lives of farmers, the health of our planet, and the health of society. First, let's hear from Heather and her family's long history working in food and agriculture.
My story goes way, way back. My grandfather was a homesteader with my amazing grandmother before I even knew what homesteading was. And that was him being a beekeeper, him running like a sugar shack, and them pretty much growing all the vegetables they could possibly ever want in their amazing gardens in the summertime, and then doing all of these intricate recipes to preserve the harvest for winter time. So as a kid, I just thought it was really fun. And now as, an adult, I am definitely reflective on like how important it was and the work they did and the traditions that they kept kind of going. So that's like a first starting point. Fast forward through my teenage years and heavy metal music and all the things that you do as a teenager, you quickly forget those connections. But when I was living out in San Francisco with my then husband, we fell in love with an early iteration of the San Francisco Farmers Market. That was our reintroduction and connection back to food. We would volunteer on the weekends at farms for harvests, and we get really interested in alternative building and just like the holistic view of sustainable living and having your footprints. We decided in 2004 to move back to upstate New York because we were really interested in doing a homesteading project ourselves. And that's really where ultimately our both full-time careers farming started. We moved out to an old piece of land and there was literally nothing there. And we cut the first acre down with a scythe and dragged a camper out there and lived. and bought, as most homesteaders do, every single book out there about how to pickle and how to make your own biochar. We were just like so into it. Um, Fast forward again, is we again fell in love with the local farm scene, really sought out buying when we could and had off farm jobs, food from like local farmers. And we noticed at the farmers market, I'm going to age myself here, but like 17 years ago, and it's very different now. But when we went, meat was fairly underrepresented. There'd be amazing bounties of vegetables and fruits and things like that. But we felt like there were meat farmers there, but they would just have like a cooler with like a cardboard sign that was like scrawled on it, like rump roast. What is rump roast? And the packaging was really terrible. Like a lot of the backpacks were broken, the meat was old, so there wasn't like a lot of energy. And we didn't know better, and we thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if someone started, at this point we were already homesteading and had all the animals in the Noah's Ark, as you do when you're a homesteader. Wouldn't it be cool if we like learn how to butcher and bring fresh meat to the farmers market? And we just thought this was something that our community would love. Clearly, it's something that we were interested in, the harvest, the traditional preservation techniques of meat. And that was the start of our business, which was called the Piggery. And that was in business for about 15 years before we sold it to another group. And that went from really teaching ourselves, because we're that old, how to butcher out of a book. This is before YouTube, and my neighbors would come over and tell us and give me the sage advice that the meat ends up on one side of the bone or the other. And we started a small scale butchering business, which grew out of our local farmers market and Ithaca Farmers Market. We felt the drive to deliver more consistent and quantities of meat to our community, because our line would legit be 60 people long at the farmers market. And really focused on whole animal butchering at the time: head cheese, rillettes, bone broth, fresh cuts, everything that was about preservation and just utilizing that whole animal. I'll share that we did have USDA slaughter, all things, but we did butcher it ourselves. And then we kept expanding and trying to find ways to keep doing our work. And we had a restaurant, and we had a local foods grocery store, and eventually decided to, the final step of our connection with farming is, at the time, I should mention, we also, at the time of doing all this butchering work, was expanding our farming operation to where we were really focused on our land, which was certified organic, and growing heritage breed hogs, and that they were pasture raised on non-GMO feed. So that was something that was like our passion point. And also having good breeding practices. Had about 800 head on this 800-acre farm at one point. Because of our community and regional demand, we started working with a number of partner farms too, and we built out a small USDA processing facility. Ultimately, we're able to service about 26 different states with our meat that was run on our protocols. That was a really long answer, but that was the journey, and I could talk about it for 7 hours, because it has all the tentacles of community and working with other farms, and um, building a protocol around food that's different than what's available in CAFOs and commercialization meat systems. There's a lot of stuff to unpack, but I don't know. That's what I do.
Next, let's hear from James about why he got into farming and soil quality.
I started cultivating back in the 90s, like I said, and I started with cannabis back in 1994. A gentleman just said that the product was garbage, and if I was going to do it organically. And so I had no idea what the words meant. I tried to start learning, but there wasn't really any information. There was a gentleman named Steve at the garden shop that I went and told I was growing tomatoes to, and he started coaching me. And really, it turned from cannabis into a love for organic growing and of all plants, which really I didn't know, but it was a love for the soil. And that's really what developed my passion for the soil, and where we're at now with GivLyfe, where we're pushing that passion of the soil and trying to reclaim the soil. Because I feel like if we can revitalize the soil, it'll help not with just our food, but with our guts, the microbiome in our humans, but also carbon sequestration. All of these issues that we're talking about right now, as buzzwords and keywords that are going on in society.
Finally, let's hear from Katherine about the winding path that she took to farming.
I grew up in Nebraska, in Lincoln, Nebraska, in the sea. And I've kind of had a curvy, I don't know, I've had a very curvy route to get to where I am now. But I went to University of Kansas for college, and I studied journalism. And I'm not quite sure what my first introduction to agriculture was, but I did after college. I started working on a small farm in Kansas City. And I wish I could remember exactly when it occurred to me in college that, I wanted to change my path. But initially what got me interested was that I grew up in the Midwest, this corn country, and I was seeing so much land being developed, farmland being developed into subdivisions, like suburban sprawl. So that was the first thing that I started noticing. And so on this farm in Kansas City, I did AmeriCorps work in the Pacific Northwest and went back to the farm for a while and then decided to go to graduate school. So I went to Tufts University, the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy, agricultural policy. So they have a agriculture, food, and environment program in that school. And I really thought I wanted to go the policy route because what started with my concern for land use and development of farmland, it just more and more I was pulled into production of actually being a farmer. So I think from a young age, I was always interested, and I just never really had access to it until I moved to other places in the country and actually saw small farms.
Taking a quick step back, I want to review once again that this episode will be talking a lot about the Farm Bill. So I want to briefly go over what the Farm Bill is and what it does. Of course, the Farm Bill is a more than 500-page piece of legislation, so it's not actually possible to quickly review what it is and what it does. But for the purposes of this episode, I want to address some key points. First of all, the Farm Bill produces subsidies that allow farmers to produce crops that might not be profitable and produce them and make a profit, right? So the subsidies allow farmers to produce things like corn and soy and a lot of these large commodity crops that then become processed foods. And the subsidies provide a guarantee to those farmers that they'll make money on those crops even when they have an overabundance or during hard times. Another thing that the Farm Bill does is it provides incentives for certain types of farming. And we'll hear a bit more about that today in terms of what the Farm Bill could be in terms of promoting and supporting sustainable agricultural practices. The Farm Bill also promotes, in theory, nutrition, mostly through SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. In fact, a huge amount of Farm Bill spending, around 80% of the money spent on the Farm Bill, goes to SNAP, which is crazy when you think about all of the different things that the Farm Bill covers. According to the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, there are 12 sections in the Farm Bill. Things like commodities are covered. Things like conservation efforts are covered. Things like forestry. Things like energy and how to pay for growing biofuel programs. And yet, despite the wide variety of programs that are covered, 80% of the spending goes to SNAP. So I just want to point that out because SNAP is going to come up again and again in today's conversation. Part of that is because the food that we eat plays such a huge role in our health outcomes. But another part of that is that SNAP predominates the spending that occurs within the Farm Bill. Speaking of the role that food plays in our health, I also want to take a step back to briefly discuss the growing food as medicine movement. Right now, millions of dollars are being spent on food as medicine research and initiatives, and a growing number of organizations are putting a lot of effort and attention towards this research and promoting policies that support this agenda. I myself have worked in this space and am a huge fan and proponent of food as medicine. And more, I hear from individuals who have changed their diet towards an healthy end and just feel better overall. So food as medicine is both growing on a national and global level, as well as on a personal level. Additionally, Just this past week, the Washington Post ran a headline about the role that ultra-processed foods are playing in disease. It is now understood by a wide variety of scientific research and organizations that ultra-processed foods drive disease, and not just things like obesity, but things like cancer, heart disease, and even mental health disorders like anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia. Knowing all of this, it is shocking to consider how much money is spent on ultra-processed foods through the Farm Bill, and we'll come back and discuss the many different ways that occurs. But I just want to lay out this conversation about food as medicine because it's so important not only to celebrate the fact that this movement is gaining so much traction, but also to talk about what we need to do as a culture to actually build out the infrastructure to enable these programs to succeed. So while it's all well and good that groups like Tufts University and Kaiser Health Systems and the Rockefeller Organization are putting money and time and energy towards these initiatives, that they're promoting food as medicine, that the White House and HHS have just hosted in the past 2 years nutrition, hunger, and health conferences, and actually a food as medicine summit just about a month ago. This is thrilling. We should all be excited about this. But oftentimes, missing from this conversation is what we actually need to do to our food system to make healthy foods more accessible for everyone. So while we address and acknowledge the role that food is playing in health and disease, while we celebrate that more and more doctors are writing prescriptions for produce, while we jump for joy over the pilot programs that are occurring all around the country promoting the use of food to treat and prevent chronic disease, we also have to ask, what are we doing to support the health of our soil so that in 50 years we'll still be able to grow healthy crops? And how is the money that we're spending on the Farm Bill to subsidize things like corn and soy to produce corn syrup and soy oils that go right into ultra-processed foods and make them much more accessible to low-income people because they're subsidized and thus cheap? How is the money that we're spending from our tax dollars up front to subsidize certain foods actually putting our health goals out of reach and making things like produce prescriptions more expensive? What could we do as a culture to shift incentives, to shift subsidies, and promote the foods that are actually recommended, not just more and more by doctors, but actually in the dietary guidelines for Americans? The foods that are being recommended are not the foods that are being subsidized, but they're being recommended and subsidized by the same organizations. So how can we shift those incentives to actually line up with the recommendations and promote the long-term health and well-being, not only of humans and society, but also of our planet and the soil that we depend on to grow the food that we need to survive? When we say food as medicine, we're not talking about processed foods. We're talking about nutrient-dense foods. And very often in agricultural spaces, those foods are referred to as specialty crops. Small farms growing specialty crops receive the least amount of support from the Farm Bill. In fact, many small farms receive no support. So again, we need to ask, how are we supporting the small farmers who actually produce these fresh, local, seasonal, nutrient-dense foods that actually function as medicine in the body, as opposed to using our subsidy dollars to subsidize foods that are making us sicker, that we know are making us sicker, right? How can we actually point to the small farmers and say, we want to support you, we want to support farmer health, community health, societal health, and personal health? Because right now, that's not who's benefiting from the Farm Bill and all of these taxpayer-funded subsidies. If we truly want to promote nutrient-dense diets, subsidies need to shift. We also need to discuss the health of soil. And for that, I'm going to turn back to my conversation with James. He spoke very clearly and passionately about the fact that soil is not just dirt, and we can't just depend on the ground to produce food for us endlessly without giving it back many of the things that we take away. Soil requires nutrients. It requires clean water. It requires thriving microbe communities that keep the soil rich and thriving and ready to produce healthy, nutrient-dense crops. So let's hear from James about some of the threats that our soil faces and what we need to do about it.
Soil health is just critical to everything. It's basically starting at the root, and I'm not meaning a pun, but when we start with the soil and we have a balanced ecosystem in the soil, it balances the microbiology that's in the food that we eat. We use a lot less pesticides and herbicides and fungicides and all these chemicals and everything that then transfer into our gut biome. And, just like animals in the field, one of the ways that we study their biomes and, what happens in their guts is we first start with their food source. And it all starts with the soil. And so the same thing with humans. And so it's so important for balancing our gut biomes, which they're now showing every single day are tied to every ailment that we have, from Alzheimer's to basically how much you want to work out. They're saying comes from the gut biome. So by eliminating these things that are killing all the microbiology, we're helping our guts flourish, our health is flourishing. Then, it unfortunately sounds kind of gross, but the excrement and everything like that then helps the planet evolve and helps it come back to life instead of everything dying and all this disease and everything that's been caused by all of it.
James has so much to say about soil and the environment. And Katherine, as a cattle farmer who relies on soil and grasslands, also had some things to say about the dangerous threats that climate change pose to her way of farming.
In my story, my background, I left out like 15 years in between where I worked on a lot of other farms. But since I've been here and now have livestock, my management structure really depends on frozen ground in the winter, so that cows can be out bale grazing and not damage the pastures. And so if it doesn't freeze in the winter, that has a huge impact. But even with annual crops, I shouldn't say everyone. What I hear most small farmers talking about is climate change.
Another complex topic in this conversation is the role that animals play in our agriculture system. While many people want to pretend like we can just go plant-based and everything magically becomes vegan and neutral and holistic and it's all good, there is an especially critical role that animals play in sustainable agriculture. Ruminants play a huge role, and their manure is extremely useful to farming, especially in a world where we're trying to move away from petroleum-based synthetic inputs. So let's hear from both James and Katherine about the role that biological systems and animals play in farming and sustainable agriculture.
The younger generations, they don't want to go in the fields. They don't want to do the work anymore. And they don't really have to anymore. We've got really cool technologies that are coming out, tractors that drive themselves, harvesters that do the same, drones that do all the work for you. But the average person in America, that nobody really pays attention to it. They don't understand how farmers have operated for centuries and how we even eat. Going to the grocery store, they don't understand that there's only probably a day and a half, 2 days maximum of food in our entire supply chain of food. If you don't have farmers, you don't have anything. I mean, people start starving to death right away, and they've shown, after 3 days of no food in the grocery store, horrible things start happening in society.
Yeah.
And so, having these breakdowns and stuff like that, I think awareness is a major thing. But at the same time, it goes back to, I've been doing this for a lot of years, and I'm one that likes to make a lot of noise, as you know. And it doesn't really matter that much. When it comes down to it, it's not a pressing thing. And the farmers feel such an obligation and such a duty that they just continue to do it. You don't see the strikes with farmers that you do with these other organizations, even though they're probably some of the least paid and the ones that we recognize the least in the entire country, where
Yeah.
they should have some representation. I think that right now we're starting to come around. We're starting to think sustainably. We're starting to see these things. If we can develop programs to help keep farming here, it increases national security while it increases food security.
Yeah.
As we can reduce our dependency on foreign fertilizers, on these things that we rely heavily from Russia, from China, from all these places from, that's one of them. But another thing is we've only got maximum 50 years worth of phosphorus left. Phosphorus is a finite resource, and it's only mined in certain places in the world, and it's a major thing that we need. So we've got to find different avenues for these things. But there's a shift right now. If we can get off of the chemical dependency of all of the nation, it's not just with agriculture, but it's in everything, plastics and everything. Everybody knows that this is bad. Everybody knows the path that we've been on for a century now is bad. But it runs big business politically, and nobody really wants to touch it. Well, now is the time that we have to touch it.
Yeah.
We don't have a choice. John Deere made their last plow they're ever going to produce.
Wow.
That's a huge statement.
Yeah.
That's saying, guess what, everybody, catch up.
Yeah.
And that's what we need. We need some companies. We need some major forward progressive thinking people out there to just take a stand and say, hey, enough is enough with all of this stuff, and let's just go the right way.
Yeah. And I think that statement applies to so much. I mean, I don't want to zoom out too broadly because we are trying to talk about the Farm Bill and agriculture, but I think that when we look at our healthcare system, for example, or even the way that we talk about mental health and mental illness, we've become
Mhm.
obsessed with identifying clusters of symptoms and then treating them based on symptom diagnoses and finding a chemical that treats a symptom and just like punching, like
Yeah.
playing whack-a-mole with our health. And the same is true of agriculture. Oh, the soil is depleted, so we'll just flood it with these chemical inputs and we'll just, mine phosphorus over here and shove it into the ground.
Yeah.
And it just creates this vicious cycle, the same way that if somebody can't pay attention and you don't even ask what they're eating and just start giving them stimulants, you're going to create a vicious cycle where you're never going to actually address the root cause. So bringing it back to what you said at the beginning, no pun intended, but unavoidable
Yeah.
pun, we
It's
have to
the
seek the
root.
root causes. And I
That's right.
totally agree with you that we need some like charismatic, big companies, big voices saying, this is not a drill. Like,
Yeah. It's
we can't do this forever. So what is next and who's going to step up and
right.
make those shifts?
We've all got the evidence now showing this way doesn't work.
Right.
So somebody's got to say, "Oh, hey, it doesn't work. Let's just go this way." And
Yeah.
it's seriously that easy. But what you're seeing is, everybody has looked at Monsanto and Bayer for so long. They're the ones scrambling right now to do this.
Right.
And the reason is because if we all knew what they really have done with killing everything on the planet, we would probably be pretty pissed.
Yeah.
But that's what it really comes down to, is the things that we were adding to the soil to make it better is what's killing everything.
Right.
Phosphorus at best is 2% available to the plants that we're feeding it to, at very best. But it's 98% available in the water sources that we drink in and poison ourselves with.
I could talk for a long time about this. I mean, me as an individual farmer, we have neighbors actually 2 different neighbors that have beef cows, and they raise them in a totally different way. And that's fine. Like, we respect them. They respect us. We're friends. We're neighbors. So I try to not judge other farmers for their own decisions. But if you're talking about corn, conventional corn, there's so much that can be done if you're trying to grow an annual crop that requires so many inputs. I think that would have to come from a policy level if if the US was going to outlaw synthetic fertilizer, which they won't. I do wish the nutrition people would, I don't know, be more open-minded about ruminants, because there's so much marginal land in the Northeast that animals could be grazing to produce high calorie, high fat, healthy food with very minimal inputs. Obviously, fruits and vegetables are very important and delicious, but a pound of ground beef has a lot more nutrition than a pound of spinach. So yeah.
Yeah.
It's not the cow, it's the how. It's how are the animals raised that I wish would be considered in the conversation.
So let's circle back to the Farm Bill. What is it? Why is it important? And how is it playing such a massive outsized role in our society right now, especially when it comes to food and health outcomes? One thing that's true about the United States is that we're great at overspending and receiving worse outcomes than we deserve for how much money we've spent. That's the case when it comes to our healthcare spending, which far exceeds any other nation, despite the fact that our life expectancy continues to go down and our health outcomes just get worse and worse every year. We suffer from a whole host of chronic diseases. Things like autoimmune disease are rampantly on the rise, and yet we keep spending more on healthcare. Well, the same is true in the food space. We're spending more and more on food, the Farm Bill, food assistance programs, and yet the outcomes that we're getting in terms of nutrition, nutrient density, and actually positive health outcomes that should come from a well-balanced diet, we're not seeing those. So we're spending more and more, and the results that we're getting are worse and worse. Truly, right now, the American way. Right now, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on the Farm Bill, and we receive some of the lowest quality food in response. In addition, low-income families who utilize the SNAP program actually have worse health outcomes than low-income families of the same income bracket who don't utilize SNAP. Why would that be? We want to believe that providing supplemental nutrition assistance would do just that. Provide nutrition assistance. But unfortunately, due to totally misspent incentive structures, it's doing the opposite. We're incentivizing people to purchase ultra-processed, nutrient-poor foods. And so the double burden of malnutrition hits those populations twice. How can we align our spending to actually promote nutrition assistance and not just cheap, ultra-processed calories that drive chronic disease? While the money spent on SNAP is currently not hitting the mark when it comes to producing the outcomes that we desire, the same can be said about farm subsidy spending only going to large agro-businesses and not supporting the small farms that we all picture in our heads. Recently, the Environmental Working Group published a paper called Farm Bill for the Few, which addressed the many ways that the Farm Bill mostly sends money to large agro-farms that are producing commodity crops and does not adequately support small farms. They quoted Agricultural Secretary Tom Vilsack as he pleaded with the committee to address these issues in the Farm Bill and to redistribute subsidies so that small family farms could also benefit. Vilsack called for a farm bill that is transformational. He said that the farm bill should level the playing field so that farmers of all kinds can turn a profit and make a living in agriculture. Vilsack asked the committee, "We must ask ourselves, do we want a system that continues to force the big to get bigger and the small to get out? That is the current state of farming in America. Large farms grow and grow, bolstered by the Farm Bill and subsidies and the production of cheap crops that fuel the processed food industry, and small farms shut their doors." So now I want to turn back to the conversations that I had with Heather, Katherine, and James and address a huge concern that farmers face, and that concern is economic. There is a loud national conversation about economic inequality, but this conversation should be even louder when we're talking about the space of farming and agriculture. Farmers live below the national poverty line at twice the rate of average citizens. It's around 30% for farm worker families, and around 15% is the national average. Let's hear from Heather about this critical situation.
There have always been, for small scale farmers, which I'm going to speak, that's my scope and experience in, there has always been the increasing challenge of, I hate this word, but competition, competing against the larger industrial food complex, right? And that competition, quote unquote, comes from, and not really from other like local farmers in your community, but that competition really comes from, can you produce your commodity, your product at a price point that people can afford in your marketplace and make a living for yourself and your family and keep that land whole? Is that possible? That's one of them. The other one is, can you can you affordably and efficiently and realistically get your product and your commodity to your consumer? Because vast majority of people spend their time at the grocery store. There's a small percentage that, like you, Marian, gets home deliveries from farmers, or people that have the time, energy, and actually the wallet to go to a farmer's market and source it out. So those have always been the pressures on farmers, as well as, so that's it. That's the capitalist part of it. On top of the general things that are happening from another scope, like global warming causing significant variations in either drought or wet seasons. All those other inputs that go along with farming. But the reason I wanted to timestamp this is because those are pre-COVID conversations, post-COVID, during and post-COVID conversations. Those are just, all of those issues are significantly magnified because there are so many things out of a small farmer's control, as to the input of when you boil down to it, this is just a business of creating a product. That are so many things are out of your control. Add a global pandemic and the supply chain challenges that have happened from that. It's everything from honey producers, like the glass jars that they put their honey into, plastic gloves for, people who work in like dairy or food or packaging plants. There are so many destabilizing economic forces that have occurred during pandemic and afterwards that we still are trying to untangle. Trucking companies went out of business. We saw that there was that gigantic inflation and gas spike. And then let's talk about inflation. So if people's buying power is going down substantially, then they are struggling to pay a higher premium for these locally produced goods, which are already under pressure from all these other economic concerns. So that is what I'm hearing more than anything else right now.
Knowing that maybe the top concern right now, in addition to environmental, is perhaps economic. That brings me to my next question, which involves policy in agriculture.
Yeah.
And how policy could and or should be shifted to better support our food system in general, maybe a healthier food system in general, maybe a more sustainable food system in general, but also for the purpose of this conversation and my own bias, support smaller farmers, community farms that are really serving their communities effectively. How can policy better support these family farms, community farms, as opposed to functioning predominantly as a handout to big ag, let's call them?
My disclosure is that I have like 900 answers, but I hope everybody else is too. So let's talk a little bit about policy and what can be done to support small farmers as part of your first question. I will share, this is not my specialty. I am a meat cutter and I'm a pig farmer, but when you're in stuff and that's your business, you do observe things. So as far as policy, if we do want to bolster small and regional farms, which there are a gazillion studies of why that's so important. It's really as the stewards of the land, keeping money in our communities and the way that those kind of grow our communities, all those concentric circles, right? So I'm just kind of saying the obvious, but how do we get there? we have to I would recommend that we find a way with our policy that we level the playing field to a little bit more. So we have to close that gap on the cost, so there's the economies of scale, right, that you get from being a gigantic farm. How do we get small farmers and mid-sized farmers to a place where the economies of scale work? Um, so they have food access for all. And how do we reduce, and that's just not, and how do we reduce, like, I think, as far as from a policy standpoint, like, how do we reduce, like, the regulation around creating food? So if we go back to the first part about, like, how do we level the playing field, is it things like looking at the farm bill that comes up after its 5-year expiration? Is there more, right now that bill really is, I think the number is like 75% like SNAP, which is great, but there's really not a lot of other, there's 7% like commodities. Like, where do we shift that 7% of that budget into not just gigantic Midwestern ag producers and create incentives? Maybe we create less incentives to make all of this corn and soy that we make into byproducts or fuel or ship overseas. Maybe we incentivize that a little bit and start to incentivize these smaller food systems. And it doesn't have to be a change overnight. Like, I'm a big advocate of like testing ideas and measuring them and kind of growing for there. And I'm not really seeing a lot of like testing that I know of this like concept. As far as like policy, I have to say, like, as far as like regulation, I had a USDA processing facility that I built, and it was teeny. It was like the size of probably 4 people's bedrooms. It was a micro plant, but I did have to have a federal inspector there every single day. So, like, can we have some scalability?
Wow.
Oh yeah, I never did anything wrong, or I'd get written up for, I don't know, really bizarre things, because they had to. But it just creates this like the layer of regulation creates a layer of work, which creates a layer of expense, which creates that like distance and equibliss between like these different facilities. So I think there's some work we can do around there.
We say we bought a farm, but there was nothing here. We bought land, and we've put all of the infrastructure in ourselves, like out of pocket. And yet we're not a dairy farm. We're not on a stream, so we can't get we haven't been able to get much help from county and state agencies because we don't have a resource concern like a stream. It's been really hard for us to kind of build the infrastructure that we needed to raise animals the way that I want to, and there's not much assistance to do that.
Farmers are most worried about the dollar in their pocket. They have such small margins that they live by right now that they're worried how increase in demands are going to apply, what's going to happen to them, how when they already feel like they've maxed out their fields and everything like that. So are they using more fertilizers and these different things? But that's where I really think that companies like what we're doing with GivLyfe come in. It's helping a farmer transition from that from traditional ag, or what we're saying is traditional ag, using synthetics, using chemicals, to using regenerative processes. But instead of having a drop in profits for 2 to 3 years, which most farmers feel like they're going to experience if they do that, then it helps them bridge that gap so we can get them past that. And I think that's right now the thing that we're seeing the most, is farmers are just concerned. A couple pennies a bushel is the difference of if they're able to buy food for their families and clothes for their kids and, go on vacations and do these things.
Turning back to the Farm Bill, let's discuss the SNAP program a little bit more. As I mentioned earlier, SNAP spending is about 80% of the spending found in the Farm Bill. While SNAP was designed to provide nutrition to low-income families, it doesn't really appear to be doing just that. And it's oddly become a cash grab for large corporations like Walmart. Walmart is the largest beneficiary of the SNAP program. According to the Pew Research Group, supermarkets and superstores like Walmart and Target together make up only 15% of SNAP-accepting establishments, but they account for nearly 80% of all redemptions. According to a report by the Government Accountability Office commissioned by Senator Bernie Sanders, millions of full-time workers rely on government benefits to make ends meet, and Walmart ranked among the top 4 largest employees of SNAP and Medicaid beneficiaries. So, to translate that, Walmart is benefiting twice from the Farm Bill because their employees can be underpaid to the point that they qualify for SNAP. And then those same employees take their SNAP benefits and spend them at Walmart. So Walmart, all they have to do is sit back, relax, and let the government dollars flow to them. When open-hearted, caring people who want a better society, who believe in SNAP, who believe in government programs, are thinking about where their tax dollars are going when they pay for these programs, I don't think they're picturing Walmart. But that is disproportionately who is benefiting from these programs. Is that what we want? Small farmers are not actually seeing a benefit from these programs. You can't really buy a CSA share with your SNAP benefits. I've spoken to the farmer who comes and delivers meat and produce to me, and he has said that he thinks it's crazy that low-income Americans can't use their SNAP benefits to shop with him. Why can't a person relying on SNAP benefits, whether for a long period of time or just to get through a hard time, why can't that person go to a local farm store, buy a side of beef, buy a CSA share, buy a milk share? That's not possible, but they can go to Walmart and buy Pop-Tarts and soda. Which of those two situations seems like it would better benefit all of society? One of the ways that we can improve the health of society is by teaching people how to cook and utilize nutrient-dense foods that you can't just find pre-prepared on store shelves. But that's a lot more possible when you know your farmer and you're able to get things locally and in season. According to a report published in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine, low-income families who use SNAP consume more junk food and have worse health outcomes than matched low-income families who don't utilize SNAP. Many other sources, including USDA data itself, support this claim. So again, we want to help low-income families, and we want to support farmers. But so much of the money that is being spent on the Farm Bill is basically being funneled into mega farms and mega corporations. So, how much are we actually spending on the SNAP program? Well, according to the report by the Pew Research Group, SNAP spending has grown over time. And because SNAP is an entitlement program that tracks along with the economy, meaning the more people are unable to afford food, the more people qualify for it, it tends to grow in times of economic hardship and then shrink in times of abundance or when jobs are up. Unfortunately, in the last 5 to 10 years, those trends have shifted, and spending on SNAP has grown and then stayed high. Again, quoting the Pew Research Group, the Great Recession changed the pattern, perhaps permanently. Spending on SNAP jumped as the economy sank, but it kept rising even as the recovery began, topping out at about $103 billion in fiscal year 2013. Spending on the program then fell slowly until the COVID-19 pandemic upended the U.S. economy. SNAP spending soared from $91.8 billion in fiscal year 2020 to $127.6 billion in fiscal year 2021 and fell back only slightly last year. So once again, we're getting worse health outcomes, we're eating the worst quality food, and yet spending continues to rise. This pattern is totally unsustainable. And meanwhile, there's a growing food as medicine movement, which is gaining a lot of attention, and rightfully so, which I personally am extremely passionate about. However, there's not enough conversation being had about the role that food subsidies and policies like the Farm Bill play in artificially skewing our society's food supply towards unhealthy foods. We're also not talking enough about the ways that Medicaid, Medicare, and private insurance companies could be helping to pick up the bill when it comes to healthy foods. If we believe that food is medicine, shouldn't health insurance pay for foods? That's a lot of the pilot programs that are happening right now, is things like Medicare and Medicaid paying for produce prescriptions. But again, What good is a produce prescription if you don't know how to cook? When I spoke with Heather, she and I tackled this exact point. I would love a program where SNAP benefits could be used to purchase not only CSA shares, but also meat shares directly from farmers. And as an extra bonus, I would love it if these programs, there's a sub-program off of SNAP called SNAP Ed, which,
Mhm.
they have a website and teaches you how to like stretch your SNAP dollars and make healthy recipes from canned goods or whatever. I'm going to be honest, most of it's pretty terrible and horrifying. But what if SNAP Ed paid for local seasonal culinary, interactive cooking? What if SNAP Ed had a weekly online cooking class that you could join that was kid friendly, that taught people, families, children how to cook fresh local seasonal foods? Because then we get to kill two birds with one stone. We get to not only support local farms and channel federal funding into local farms by way of feeding low-income people with healthy, nutritious local foods, but we also get to promote cooking and food knowledge, because one of the biggest things that's going wrong in our food system is that people who struggle with food insecurity also struggle with, they don't have access or time to prepare, home cooked, nourishing meals. So I feel like if we could create this dream pilot program in which SNAP dollars can go right to farmers, but as part of that program, there's cooking lessons and just awareness raising around seasonal foods and regional food systems. Ah, that's just the dream. That's the dream right there.
I'm gonna copy. Okay, I'm copying on your homework here. I'm gonna steal that from you because that's like I think that's really brilliant. And actually, you just like sparked this idea for me too. It's like, what if we go like one step further and we pilot? We test a program where we take these seasonal foods that come from our regional food shed, um, and we bring them to a kind of like a packaged or prepared foods plant, and we create a simple line of like almost like TV dinners or like pre-heat
Yes.
meals that is like bolstering and the sales and supporting our regional farmers. We're creating more nutrient dense food. We're like developing that palette of like, all right, turnips aren't so bad to eat, turnip mashies, or maybe some beets or like sweet potatoes, like start to
Yes.
develop that palette. And then it starts like to feed into like, and this is how you make this from this, because it's really, it is jarring to go from a space that we have, and unfortunately within like poverty, like food nutrition levels where it's McDonald's and this is where the palate is gone to.
Right.
And then being like, well, cool. How about we just replace it with like root vegetables? And that is that you don't know how to cook. And maybe
Right.
your oven in your apartment never seems to work. Like, how do we bridge that gap? And maybe it's kind of doing a pilot program like that.
I am now going to piggyback off what you said because, yes, 100%. And I just had a conversation a few weeks ago with my former advisor and lifetime mentor, who I adore, Dr. Katie Holton. And she and I offline have had conversations around the importance of healthy cooking and eating. And, I was saying to her, in the food as medicine movement, one of the things that we don't talk enough about is that no one knows how to cook. And I actually went into DC and met with the culinary medicine students at GW Med School. These are future doctors who have chosen to take an elective where they are learning how to cook nutrient-dense foods that are targeted towards disease prevention and resolution. So kudos to them. I watched them cook for an hour and they were terrible. I mean, like, respect. They
Yeah.
were there. They were in it. But I was like, "Ooh, can I help you chop that kale? Because it's gonna take you 12 hours to chop that kale, but you could just roll it up and fold it over." And they were like, right? This is not just missing from the future doctors. This is missing from everyone. You and I both have worked in food service. We've both had kitchen training and worked in the culinary arts. We know how to cook. Even so, I spend hours a day cooking. It's still time
Yes.
consuming, right? So I believe strongly that food is medicine and that the future of our healthcare and food system are connected. And while I agree with Dr. Holton, whose position, as she stated it to me, was like, we need to get people cooking, I totally agree. I think that cooking is an integral part of eating. However, I think that the changes that we need right now need to involve prepared foods. And as a bonus, there can be companies that can turn a little profit on it, like we can set up a system where somebody makes a little cash, so they're incentivized to do this. So why don't we go into food sheds,
Mm-hmm.
get the local seasonal foods, take federal funds to pay small local farms and incentivize these farmers to keep growing their nutrient-dense local specialty crops, and then hire local chefs to prepare these foods en masse, package them in the way that they're, maybe like 1 week non-perishable, not like TV dinner 2 years in the freezer, but like a week.
You can do a gas flush. You can. Yep.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
then send those out through regional food as medicine systems to people who need these foods to prevent or reverse type 2 diabetes, hypertension, etc.
I'm 100% in alignment with this. And there already are some additional, I know you know all about this, but the movement is happening this way as the medicine is food. One of the things that I'm most excited about, when we get off topic, is that doctors and hospitals are starting to script groceries and that insurance companies are starting to pay for it.
Yes.
So how do we just like dovetail all of these initiatives together?
Yes. That
So
is
cool,
it.
right?
Produce prescriptions, SNAP education focused on local regional foods,
Mhm.
and finding ways because, just to kind of bring this home with the everything is connected conversation, a lot of farmers are depressed, suffer from depression, hopelessness, desperation. And
Yes.
these are the people who feed us. Like, we can't just let them sink into desperation. We need to lift them up. And I really feel like as a society, as a community, we're all in this together, protecting and securing our food system for the future and our health. And luckily, there are things that we can do that are at the intersection of supporting the mental and physical health of farmers and their families, supporting the health and sustainability of the soil and the food system. And when we do that, it will inherently support chronic disease reduction and chronic disease management. So it's like great news. I mean, like bad news. Right now, it's all kind of going off track. But great news, there are places where this Venn diagram overlaps. And if we work at the intersection of these issues, there can be a ripple effect that solves many big problems all at once.
And we get the policymakers on board because what? It saves us money if people's chronic diseases go down or solve for. There's less like medical care and all the other attributable expenses that go out, like less productivity at work, all of those things. So this is just one of those situations where it's a win-win-win across the board, you know?
The future of food relies on the future of the environment and the future of citizens who are willing to stand up and speak out about the needs of our bodies, our soil, our planet, and our society. I asked each of my guests what they believe the average citizen can do to promote the future of food and health in America and to support their local farms. Let's hear from James first.
I think that right now we're starting to come around. We're starting to think sustainably. We're starting to see these things. But the number one thing I would tell everybody to do is look at the prices of the food. You know, when a couple months ago there was a huge spike and nobody said anything. I travel outside of the country a bunch, and I was in Colombia. I left for Colombia, and eggs were like $1.89, like normal for a 12 pack of eggs for a dozen. I came back and they were $3.99 a dozen. And there was a little bit of news here and there about food prices, but in the everybody just, oh, whatever. But who is that affecting?
Right,
The farmers don't get any more money.
right.
They're just still out there just busting their butts and doing the things. So where in the supply chain is all of this money going? There's a reason why people like Bill Gates have been buying up all the farmland that they possibly can.
Yeah,
He now
suspicious.
owns 300,000 acres of farmland in the US. Well, same thing, if you look at the major investment companies around the world and you see what's going on, and there is just an underlying precedence for it. But I think raising awareness, doing what you're doing, the podcast, I love it, by the way.
Thank you.
And I think it's really cool that you're talking about all these things. And, the more we can do that, just all the way across the board, it just helps, people to do that and raise the awareness of, hey, oh, you stick that thing in your mouth. Like I ate hot dogs until I watched that special on hot dogs and how they were made, or the imitation crabs thing. Oh my
Oh,
God.
yeah.
We have no idea what we put in our bodies, and yet we still do.
Now let's hear from Katherine.
I would say buy locally produced food as much as you can and keep money in your own community, supporting local farmers and food producers, whether that's like here we have an amazing bakery that's connected with a flour mill and the farmer growing grain. So I think arrangements like that are happening more and more around the country. My mother still lives in Nebraska and she probably has to work harder, but she can find local food there. Yeah, I think everybody should know their farmers. The average person, that would help a lot. But also the like energy use in the food system is an important part for me. Just in transportation, getting food here from California or South America or wherever. That's another reason if you're buying locally, there's less, there's just fewer hidden costs, right? I don't know. As a relevant example, like all of my meat is vacuum sealed in plastic, which I hate. I hate single-use plastic, but my butcher is like half an hour away and it's an amazing family that owns this butcher shop. And the people that work there are paid well and they're great. I love working with them. And it's like, that's a local business too, that's employing people in a rural community.
Finally, let's hear from Heather about what she thinks the average citizen can do to promote the health and food security of our future.
What can folks boots on the ground, day-to-day living do to affect change? I hate to state the obvious, right? But I'll say it. It's like, investing in these businesses. And that means finding a way like to have a CSA share, which means they're actually these days, vegetable CSA shares are cheaper than buying, vegetables in the grocery, but like investing the time at that point to learn how to like cook in season and new recipes. So there's work that kind of goes along with it. If you're financially not in a space, which I understand that you can't really buy as much local as you'd want to buy from your local farmers, if you could invest some of your time, and that means like writing and calling your legislators and letting them know that you would like more of the farm bill, which comes up, I think, in January, more expenditures to be invested into our local agriculture system. So those are the two fast paths forward that I can recommend.
Listen, it's not all doom and gloom. There is a lot to be excited about and hopeful for. Right now, there are many bipartisan bills in the Senate that promote both healthy foods and the use of food as medicine, and also the future of sustainable farming. I personally feel very optimistic about this future. 20 years ago, when I was first starting out working in the health food space and healing myself using food, I could never have imagined that there would be such a loud national conversation about the role of food as medicine. I mean, right now, there are health insurance companies paying for produce prescriptions. People with high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes are actually getting prescriptions for produce and for healthy meals. That is so exciting. It's not all bad news. But it is complicated news, and it is confusing news because, again, we're spending all this money to promote and subsidize the foods that we now know, we are positive, the headlines are running, the science is in. These foods are making us sick, and these corporations are profiting handsomely from it. But there are so many people working right now to promote the concept and the methods of food as medicine, and all we have to do as citizens is support our policymakers in restructuring the incentives in our society to put healthy food within reach, and then also restructuring the way that we do agriculture and farming so that our soil thrives and survives, and we have food and can grow food and produce it long into the future. I am so grateful to Heather and James and Katherine for speaking with me today. And I'm so grateful to every single person listening who's interested and curious and wants to think more about the complicated relationship between our food system, farming, agriculture, nutrition, and health. All of these topics are so important to me and so important to the future and health of our society. So, what do we need to do next? What's my call to action? What do I think citizen advocates can do to move this process forward? First of all, we need major changes to the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill needs to promote sustainable agriculture. We need healthy microbes added back into our soil, and we have to think about the role that climate change is playing in our agricultural systems and the role that food and water quality will play in our health overall. We have to have a farm bill that supports not just large commodity farms, but small family farms. The farm bill should level the playing field, not totally wipe it away. We also need to reduce the incentives for growing commodity crops that simply get turned into junk food that makes us sick. And we need to make some changes to the SNAP program. I don't want to sound too controversial, and I certainly don't want to sound like I'm advocating for reductions in choice. But choice is not really what's happening when someone who's trying to stretch $100 across an entire month sees that soda and cookies are on sale and sitting right by the checkout. That's not choice. That's inducement. That's being backed into a corner. That's survival. That's fight or flight. Real choice looks like actual healthy options. Real choice looks like nutrition education. To that end, there is a program called SNAP Ed, and SNAP Ed could be used to teach people how to buy locally in season and how to use nutrient-dense foods and how to cook those foods that many people don't even know how to produce. For example, my family eats chicken hearts. Our farmer has chicken hearts from all the chickens he produces, and the average person doesn't know that chicken hearts are both delicious and extraordinarily nutrient dense. So we get this super cheap source of protein, he gets to prevent food waste, and we also get to eat something that's delicious and loaded with B vitamins and other great nutrients. Does the average low-income person know how much nutrition they could be getting from things like chicken hearts and how delicious that could be? Why isn't SNAP Ed going into communities and teaching people how to reach out to local farmers, to buy crops in season, to cook those crops into delicious, nutrient-dense soups, stews, breads, crackers, snacks, and also to use perhaps parts of animals that are less popular but are just as delicious and sometimes even more nutritious? We need to bring back home economics to public schools. Now, granted, when I was in middle school, home economics taught me how to make chocolate chip cookies and not to lick a wooden spoon. But it could teach so much more. Picture a home economics where they're making fresh salad dressings, or a home economics where they're soaking beans overnight and talking about how to release the phytic acid and make those beans more nutrient dense and digestible. This is all part of my bigger dream for society, but I believe that these changes could happen and need to happen quickly to support and sustain the future of health and wellness in America. Finally, when it comes to farm bill spending, and frankly, all government spending, I think, we have to consider the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line refers to considering not only the financial expense, but also the environmental and social expenses. To quote the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, or the FAO, underpinning the unsustainability of agri-food systems are costs that are hidden behind price tags and go unaccounted for by agri-food system actors. These hidden costs, including water pollution, biodiversity loss, and non-communicable diseases, are driven by negative externalities and other market failures, as well as by policy and institutional failures. The key to transitioning agri-food systems towards sustainability is to measure and value these hidden costs across the environmental, social, and health dimensions. We cannot just ask ourselves, how much are we spending? Although that is a very important question, and the answer currently is too much. We also have to ask ourselves, what are we spending it on? What unintended consequences are occurring? And how is that spending driving spending elsewhere? How is our spending on junk food and SNAP driving up healthcare spending, putting Medicare for all totally out of reach? If we could shift spending in SNAP and shift the spending in the Farm Bill to support small farms and specialty crops and local and sustainable agriculture, how could we reduce our healthcare spending overall and make the future of health and nutrition in America more sustainable and more affordable? It's going to take each and every one of us. Yes, there are passionate people like myself in this space who are doing this work. And yes, I have hundreds of incredible colleagues all over the space who are fighting to make food as medicine happen. I know so many incredible farmers who have dedicated their lives to producing food, despite the fact that it is a very difficult profession. Farmers are struggling with crazy weather changes, with financial issues, with crop problems, and they keep showing up day after day, as James mentioned, because farmers really care and they're hardcore, and we're so grateful for them. The farmers are doing amazing work. The people working in the policy space trying to move these healthy programs forward are doing amazing work. But we, the people, citizen advocates, play a critical role. Call your congressperson, call your senator, reach out to your governor, talk to people in your community. Do they realize that there are threats to farming, to the future of food in our country? Support local farms. Go to the farmers market. Get a CSA share. Find a farm near you that you can visit and ask the farmer, what do you worry about? What keeps you up at night? Asking my farmer that question is what led me to want to produce this episode. Next time you go to the doctor, ask your doctor, why aren't you recommending dietary changes? The science now shows that ultra-processed foods are driving chronic diseases. Is it possible that some of my illnesses, my diseases, my symptoms, the things for which I take multiple medications, could be driven by diet? Are there any dietary changes that you would recommend? Doctors need to hear this. Doctors need to know that patients are hungry for change, and that change starts on farms and in the kitchen. We need to demand change. Otherwise, nothing will change, and we're all in this together. I'm so passionate about human health, but over the years, I've learned that it's not possible to be passionate about human health without also caring about planetary health, the health of our soil, the health of our systems, the health of our government. It's all connected. So, thank you so much for listening to this unique episode of the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that you came away from it with even more questions. For more information on my 3 guests, please find links in the show notes that will take you to all of the amazing work that they do. For more information on me, Marian, and for any follow-up questions about this episode or any ways that maybe I can help you figure out how to get involved in this work or shift your own health, please visit marianflaxman.com. Find me on Instagram and LinkedIn. There are also links in the show notes. This episode was produced, as always, by Brain Trust Productions and sponsored by Informed Solutions Consulting. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.